Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
Do you have any Excedrin or extra strength Tylenol?
Gee, I think all I got is acetylsalicylic acid generic. See, I can get 600 tablets of that for the same price as 300 of a name brand. That makes good financial sense. Good advice.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Brian Auten, and I'm here with Chad Gross. Greetings, Chad.
How's it going, man?
Good. The end of another week and ready to make a podcast.
Yes, indeed.
We got something interesting and different for you. If you look at the title of the podcast, you'll see something along the lines of Advice for Apologists. Don't worry, it's not from us. Just a little bit of background. A lot of the interviews that I've done in the past with various thinkers and apologists and historians and New Testament scholars and things like that, one of the goals in recording all of those was always to ask for their advice for apologists. And when I say apologists, that was me at the time thinking, how can I better defend the faith? I want some advice, and let this be a helpful resource for those who are wanting to share their faith, defend their faith, evangelize, and think thoughtfully and share thoughtfully their Christian convictions, win others to Christ. So I happened to go through some of the transcripts of some of these interviews, and I found that I really liked what I went back to read. The answers were really great, and I thought, why not compile some of those for a podcast and talk about them? We're going to share with you some extracts from past interviews from apologists. So we've got Mark Mittelberg, J.P. Moreland, John Warwick Montgomery, Edgar Andrews, Ken Samples, Rob Bowman, Bruce Little, Craig Blomberg, Peter J. Williams, Lee Strobel, Greg Koukl. Maybe we'll get through them all. I don't know. But there's a lot of great content here, and I hope you'll stick around and listen through it because there's a lot of wisdom here.
Let's get ready. Switch me on.
Well, Chad, I have you to blame or to credit for this idea.
You're welcome.
Because you mentioned that interview with Swinburne, and so I went back and listened to it because you said, oh, well, he had some really good stuff to say. I thought, well, I want to hear that again because I don't remember exactly what he said. So I went back and listened to that, and I thought, yeah, that's kind of what helped me get that idea. So let's look at the first one, and then you can chime in after that and let me know what you think.
Sounds great.
So I asked the question of Mark Mittelberg. I said, what kind of advice would you want to give to a room full of Christian apologists if you only had a minute or two to talk with them? And he says, remember that our goal is to win people to Jesus, to present the gospel. And Josh McDowell said it years ago in his book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. Give enough apologetics to clear out the barriers and then get back to the point that Jesus, his love, his forgiveness, his sacrifice on the cross, and the gospel message. I'd rather lead someone to Christ who still has lots of confusion about various philosophical and theological subpoints. Lead him to Christ. Let him be forgiven. Let him be filled with the Holy Spirit, and then let them, through the discipleship process, sort out a lot of that other information. I'd rather do that than spend all my time debating every fine point and never lead him to Christ. So make the gospel the centerpiece of what your life, ministry, and teaching is all about. I think God's going to use it. I think he's going to anoint you. I think he's going to empower your message and your teaching. And I think the end result will not just be people convinced by your persuasiveness, but people converted by your message of Christ. So that was Mark Mittelberg on some advice for apologists. Any thoughts on that, Chad? I have a few.
Yeah, well, the first thing that I really like about what Mr. Mittelberg has to say here is that the idea of keeping Christ the center of your apologetic and making sure that you are keeping the gospel message and his sacrifice on the cross central. Because I remember when I first became a Christian, one of the things that I found myself doing is I did find myself arguing for extended periods of time over peripheral issues. For example, issues like the age of the earth. And finally, somebody pointed out to me that, well, let's say you win that argument. How much closer to the cross is that person? Is that really going to make them, like, let's imagine you win the argument there. Are they going to go, oh, okay, now I'm ready to accept Jesus? And so I think there's great wisdom in knowing what is central to the gospel and focusing on that, and then allowing those other peripheral issues to be sorted out later.
Yeah, sort of like the same thing with sanctification. You wouldn't You wouldn't say, okay, well, I don't see that you're living in accordance with all the things the Scripture says would be a holy life. So let's get you sorted out with holiness first, and then we'll make sure that you accept Jesus. Let's clean you up first. In the same way with apologetics, they don't need to understand everything. They don't have all the confusion removed. Basically, just the obstacles and the barriers that would be in the way. And I always think of it like gardening or farming, where the farmer is removing stones, cutting down thorns and things that are in the way that would try to hinder either the seed being planted or for it growing properly. And if he has the opportunity to do that, then that's what apologetics is in the realm of evangelism. It's a little bit different when we're talking about apologetics for Christians, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Strengthening and bolstering the faith and whatnot. But when it comes to sharing Christ with people, apologetics is simply a tool to aid in that, you know?
Yes.
So we got one from J.P. Moreland.
All right, so you asked J.P. Moreland if you could isolate, say, one or two main words of advice for the next generation of apologists, what would it be? And he said, number one, realize that we're a team and that you have a role to play. You don't have to be everything. This is important. You don't have to be Bill Craig. You can play a role. You find your role in the team and you play your role. And I believe that there are an awful lot of apologists that will be listening to us that have been called by God to be really good generalists. Now, what that means is that they're not going to be specialists in any particular area. And there is a certain frustration, Brian, that comes with that because you feel like you're always vulnerable to better people in a certain area because you're not an expert in that area. My word to people would be, my first piece of advice is learn to feel comfortable with your limitations and realize that there are other people on the team that can handle those bigger questions if you can't. And that's okay. It's not a failure. You haven't been derelict in your duty. You're probably called to be a skilled generalist and to keep up on 7, 8, 9, 10 areas and to learn basically how to navigate those. But good Lord, you've got 24 hours a day. You're not going to be able to become an expert. The first thing is we're a team. Feel comfortable with your role on the team, and that's the first thing. The second thing would be to really give people the space when you're witnessing to be honest with you where they're at and to give people permission to have doubts, to raise questions, and to treat them with respect as you try to answer what's troubling them. And those would be two pieces of advice I think are very important.
Yeah, I love that because that speaks to me. I feel that pressure. I often have insecurities and fears, and I think maybe I should quit because I'm not an expert, but that's what I am. I'm a generalist. I know a variety of things pretty good, but if I start trying to teach deeply on anyone, you'll quickly see I'm not an expert. And that's been and sometimes still is a source of, oh man, should I be doing this? So this encourages me. Thanks, JP. That thing where he says you've got 24 hours in a day, you're not going to be able to become an expert. Just releasing myself, or if you're listening, you're like, hey, that sounds like where I feel like too. There's a 24 hours in the day, and to put unnecessary pressure on yourself to, oh man, I have to be as smart as somebody else, or that thing where you compare yourself to other people can be paralyzing, especially when you're comparing, like, you look out and you see 10 experts and you're like, well, I know those 10 topics a little bit, but I'm not an expert in those 10 topics. Well, neither of those people, they're an expert in maybe one topic and they've spent their life reading and studying and writing and slaving over those topics. So to release yourself from that sort of pressure or paradigm or whatever is real important. So that team player thing, that's great.
Yeah, knowing that there's a team and that you have resources that you can reach out to or point people to is incredibly important. If somebody has questions, for example, about the soul, J.P. Moreland would be a great person to point people to, right? But of course, you may not have studied that area out, and there's nothing wrong with admitting that, which ties really nicely into the second part, his second piece of advice. I think it's important to not only allow people to be honest with you, give them permission to have their doubts, raise questions, treat them respectfully, but also to be genuine with them. If you're in a conversation, you don't know the answer to a question, there's no shame in saying, I have not thought about that. Let me get back to you. And going and then looking into that question. But of course, you need to make sure you get back to them. And I can certainly relate to this idea of wanting to be looking at someone like Richard Swinburne you mentioned. I remember when I first discovered the discipline of apologetics, which I guess I didn't really know it was called that. I just would have said it was history, philosophy, theology, because they crosses all those disciplines. And I remember thinking my goal was to be like somebody like a J.P. Moreland or Richard Swinburne. And of course, it's taken a long time for God to work out in me that, Chad, you're not Richard Swinburne. You're not William Lane Craig. That's not even the purpose I have for you. And so I think that's great advice as well.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, JP. Let's go talk to John Warwick Montgomery. For those who are listening, if I had more than 24 hours in the day, then I probably would, go excerpt all these quotes and just play them. But, we're trusting you that you'll go back and download these things and listen to them for your own betterment.
Exactly.
I'm really glad when I look back and I see there's something that was made 12 years ago and it's like, wow, that's just as relevant right now. Happy days for that. Anyway, John Warwick Montgomery, I say, when you get a classroom full of students that want to pursue the same sort of vocation as yourself in defense of Christianity, what sort of advice do you want to impart to them? You mentioned some of the pitfalls in the spiritual disciplines and intellectual disciplines, but what is the sort of overall thing you want to impart to them as you have students in a classroom setting like you do at the International Academy? So I'm talking to him about that stuff. Montgomery replies, well, there are several things. The first is that none of it is going to be worth anything unless the Christian has a real concern for the condition of the non-Christian. And you've got to be willing to become all things to all men, that by all means some can be saved. A Jew to the Jew, a Greek to the Greeks. We cannot take the kind of approach that the presuppositionalist does, that we remain within the framework of our presuppositions and the non-Christian is over there in another universe. He is not. We're all in the same universe. We're living in the same world. The factual world is the same for all of us. And what we've got to do is to be willing to start where the non-Christian is. Show him the same kind of good reasoning he's employing in ordinary life to survive, if applied to religious questions, will vindicate Christian faith. So that is certainly the first point. The second point is that in order to do good apologetics, one has got to have an understanding of the non-Christian positions, and that means doing some work in the area. When Paul defended the faith on the Areopagus in Athens, Acts 17, he quotes Stoic poets and the Stoics. He didn't learn that in rabbinic school. He had to take the trouble to read the Stoics in order to be able to witness to them. Too many evangelicals are simply lazy. They're unwilling to do the work necessary to understand the non-Christian. And if one doesn't understand that, one is not going to be able to speak to the non-Christian effectively. He will not have the respect of the non-Christian. And then finally, of course, you've got to know the best arguments in behalf of the gospel, and that means that a lot of work is going to be necessary there. People are not born apologists. This is a learned skill, and it takes some work for the lost, and if we really are concerned for the lost, we ought to feel compelled to do this. And there's a lot in there, but I think for me, the overall thought is that, meeting people where they're at and doing the work and learning how to engage with them, and that it's a skill that you can learn,
Yes. Yeah. I think I took three things from that. First of all, he takes quite a shot at the presuppositionalists. Sorry if you're a presuppositionalist and you're listening. Okay. And secondly, I would say I love the idea. I love how he's bold enough to say that some evangelicals are simply lazy. I do run into, not all Christians, of course, but a number of Christians who will put a lot of work into learning certain skills or going on YouTube and figuring out how to do things around their house. And of course, those things are important. But then when you bring up the idea of learning to defend their faith, they don't seem to even think that's part of what it means to be a Christian. And then thirdly, of course, I think being able to take time to understand opposing views, where he says, you need to take time to understand the non-Christian. I think that's really important, because otherwise we're attacking straw men, arguments they're not even presenting. And also it's frustrating for the unbeliever, and it doesn't make us an effective witness.
Yeah, good stuff. Well, there's a few more to go here, so we'll move on. Now, I'm going to read the next one because it's a long quote, but it's so good.
It's huge.
It's all me.
Yeah.
Now, this is by Edgar Andrews, and maybe some people aren't familiar with him, but hey, one of the books that I read by him is called Who Made God? Back in 2009 that was released. But it was one of those books when I read it, I thought, this is so unique and different, but it's so simple and relatable. I just realized, well, by the way, he's an English physicist and an engineer. It was so relatable. And he used just stories and illustrations, and it was like, wow, this is great and different. I really appreciated it. So the question I asked him was along that line of how to make it relatable and approachable. So here it goes. Listen in, a lot of great nuggets here. So I say, what sort of advice would you have for the apologists in making their case for Christianity relatable and approachable? And I'm thinking of how you use illustrations in the book. You're making complex ideas simple. You're using humor and anecdotes. What kind of advice would you have for Christian apologists? So Edgar Andrews replies, well, that's a very perceptive question. It opens up a whole new area which we can't obviously get into in depth on this occasion. I think that Christian apologetics has perhaps lost its way. Now, then we could take that too seriously. There's some very fine work being done in Christian apologetics. But it has become, I think, too much about your philosophy. And that is great fun for people who are interested in philosophy, to argue these cases, to consider these various proofs and rebuttals. These apologetics to date go way above the heads of the great majority of people who are not trained in logic, who are not familiar with philosophical expressions. So it's a completely closed book to them. We need something that relates to the average person much more closely. Now, I draw a lot of benefit from traditional apologetics. I read these great men, these great apologists, those who write these philosophical books. I don't always understand them, but I read them, and I try to understand them. But I recognize that there's no way I can turn to my small congregation. I'm the acting pastor of a small Baptist church, and I have to preach to a congregation of people who are not trained in science, and they're certainly not trained in theology or philosophy. And I have to get across to them the essence of the rational arguments for God, among other things. That's not the main thing, of course. And when it comes to my neighbors, non-church goers, who have no acquaintance with the Bible either, it is even more necessary to get down to their level, to speak their language, and to engage with the arguments. And my advice would be to sort of get down alongside them. You know, when you talk to a small child as an adult, you squat down or you kneel down, you get down to their level, so you're not talking down to them or over their heads, you're talking to them face to face. Now, that's just an illustration, but that's what we've got to do with apologetics. And in order to do that, we've got to be familiar with their world and their thought forms. You've got to read newspapers, you've got to involve yourself with people, and you've got to get close to them and find out what it is that moves them, and what it is that motivates them, what it is that occupies their thoughts. The Lord Jesus Christ did this, didn't he, so wonderfully in his parables. He would be there, and the crowd would have gathered around, and he would look up onto the hillside, and he would see a farmer sowing his seed, and he would tell the parable of the sower. He would take something that was familiar to them, something that was part of their everyday life, and we would turn it into a spiritual lesson. I think we've got to get close to the common man, as it were, in that way. The common man also includes people who've had scientific training, philosophical training, medical training. You've got to get into their thought forms. I would say, read my book and see how I do it, at least. It isn't the only way to do it. I would say, read the sermons of Martin Lloyd-Jones, who said that the letter he treasured most was from a very young girl, a child who used to be brought to the church, Westminster Chapel, by her parents. There was a time when Martin Lloyd-Jones was ill and wasn't able to preach for some considerable time, some months, and this young lady wrote him a letter when he returned to the pulpit and said, "I'm so glad you're back because you're the only preacher I can understand." Read his sermons because he spoke in a way that people could understand, that children could understand, and above all, read the parables and the teachings of the Lord Jesus Christ himself because he was the teacher par excellence, addressing the thoughts, the thought attitudes, the thought forms of the ordinary man, and connecting with them, engaging with them, and getting his message across using the vehicle of illustration. In some cases, humor is something I try to employ as well. Doesn't go down well with everybody, but most people like it. Well, that was a mouthful, but now you can understand why I wanted to read it, because it was just like, wow, I love this quote.
I love this plan. I'm excited to be a part of it. Let's do it. Well, a couple things that stuck out for me. First of all, I agree. Very powerful. Is I like how he does point out in the beginning, especially of the quote, but it's also the content of the entirety of the quote, this idea of apologetics being a lot about philosophy. And I think that the philosophical renaissance that people like William Lane Craig and Alvin Plantinga talk about within Christendom is a great thing, because a lot of the ideas that trickle down to the common man start in the university. And so I think I don't want to downplay that. I think it's a great thing. But I also think he has a lot of wisdom in saying that those philosophical works are great, but how do we take those concepts and put them, as my wife likes to say, put the cookies on the bottom shelf? Make them understandable for the layman, for the person who goes to a 9 to 5 every day and might not have time to dig into philosophy on a regular basis and those types of things. I also love the idea, and it's actually consistent with that Richard Swinburne interview, is this idea of finding out not only where the person is, what they take for granted, and then starting there, but also finding out what moves them and what's important to them and starting there. And then, of course, I love how he goes back to the example of Jesus and encourages us to follow the example of Jesus. That is something sometimes I do some thinking on, is if Jesus were walking the earth now, would his apologetics look necessarily like a lot of popular apologetics? And I think he highlights that really well. So, yeah, a lot of good stuff there. What do you think?
Yeah, well, the whole quote is basically, how can we communicate better our apologetics? And he doesn't downplay understanding and using, the heavier philosophical tools, but it's a matter of getting down to people's level. And so in a way, it's an encouragement, like we were sort of on the right track with that other podcast, how can we take something and make it simpler and more concise without losing the kernel, being able to communicate a little bit better. All right, so Ken Samples, he'll be coming on very soon.
Yes.
But here was I think maybe one of the first interviews with Ken. He's a regular on the podcast. So I talked to Ken Samples and I said, you had mentioned different mentors in your life, and part of the reason for this interview is to gain insights from your experience. So I want to ask you, what advice do you give to those who are just starting out in apologetics and want to go deeper? So, question about just starting out. Ken says, I think there are a number of things that I would offer in terms of advice. I think one thing that I would say, that it's very important that if you're interested in apologetics, that you appreciate that in the ancient world, apologetics was seen as a branch of theology. And what I mean by this is I think it's very important in apologetics to tie your apologetic thinking, whether you're interested in science apologetics or historical, philosophical, maybe counter-cult apologetics, or even literary apologetics, the kind of things that we see in Lewis and Tolkien and others, that you tie those areas to a very robust biblical theology. And maybe Walter Martin would put it that apologists also need to be theologians. I think sometimes apologists can make a mistake if they become Mormon experts on Mormonism, or experts in a particular area. It's very important, I think, to know what you're defending, to have an appreciation for biblical theology, historical theology, and philosophical theology. I don't want to give the impression, though, that an apologist needs to know everything, but to have a very robust approach to the Bible and to theology. To me, that's something that I think would be very significant to young apologists. What are your thoughts, Chad?
I like the idea that I think he's highlighting of understanding that your apologetics needs to tie to theology. And I think that's often overlooked that in the ancient world, that apologetics was seen as a branch of theology. And so there's nothing wrong with becoming a Mormon expert. But before you do that, you should make sure that you're majoring on Christian doctrine, Christian theology, and then delving into that.
So another one here from Rob Bowman. That was a really enjoyable interview, but I asked him what advice he would give to the next generation of Christian apologists. So Rob Bowman says, we desperately need many Christians to become excellent in their respective fields. We need Christian philosophers. We need Christians who are physicists, who are biologists, who are chemists, who are engineers, who are artists, who are theologians, of course. We've got a lot of those, but we can use some really good ones in every generation. We need a lot of good ones, so we're always going to need that. We need good biblical scholars, good Christian evangelical Old Testament scholars who are not afraid to do primary research. We need good evangelical Christian archaeologists. We don't have as many of those as I'd like. I'm not saying that there aren't any, but we need more. And we need those who are really willing to pursue excellence in those fields, because very often Christian apologists find themselves settling for a kind of recycled exclamations or recycled arguments from decades gone by that really need to be updated. In some cases, may even need to be abandoned. We need to have people who are current in the field who know what they're talking about. And we need people who are not only excellent in their fields, but we're always going to need people who are big picture people, who look at the different fields, look at biblical studies and science and philosophy, and try to see how they relate to one another, and try to see how they can have some mutual reinforcement and feedback to one another. And then he goes on, and I'm skipping ahead in his answer here, and he says, we really need people who are saying, I'm going to be the best physicist I can be for the glory of God, and I'm going to use my knowledge and my expertise at this discipline to advance human knowledge in this area in a way that brings glory to God. This is what Christians historically used to do all the time. And a little bit later he continues and says, so there's a lot of needs where everybody can play a part in Christian apologetics. You don't have to have a PhD in philosophy or science. You don't have to be a theologian. Wherever you are, mothers, fathers, kids going to school, whatever it is, guys working on the job, apologetics can be a useful part of the Christian witness to a world that needs to know that Christianity is true. So I really like that one, Chad, because it was lengthy and I kind of skipped through different points, but it sort of underscores what we were saying before, is that you're part of the team. Like Moreland was saying, you're part of the team, and that it doesn't matter if you are an archaeologist. Well, do that to the glory of God, or do your schoolwork for the glory of God, or if you're a stay-at-home parent, whatever it is, you're doing that to the glory of God, and apologetics can play a role in showing that Christianity is true.
I think that is a temptation, especially for young people who are getting into apologetics, is they tend to think that I need to figure out a way to do this full time. And, there are certainly a lot of opportunities to do that, and a small number of people get to do that. But many times God's calling us to just be great at what we're already doing and to exercise apologetics. And then if he wants to move you into a more full-time capacity, then he, of course, has the ability to do that. I think, too, that Scripture itself gives the illustration, of course, that we are the body of Christ. Just like J.P. Moreland, Richard Swinburne, Stephen Meyer, whoever you want to name that we would say is very prominent, very famous or whatnot, we would say, well, someone might think, I want to become like them. But Stephen Meyer has a part that God has called him to in the body, but he's also called you to a part in the body. And just because Stephen Meyer's role may be more publicly visible doesn't mean it's more important than what he's called you to, because we're each called to be faithful where he's put us. Yeah.
All right. So another one here from Bruce Little. I asked him what advice he would have for the next generation of Christian apologists. Noticing a trend? He says, oh my, that's a wonderful question. I just came from a PhD seminar, where we were discussing the issue today. I would say, 1, if you want to be a Christian apologist, you need to understand what are the broad categories of concern for your culture. The broad categories are epistemology and ontology. You need to be informed in those areas and how that works out in your everyday existence and practice. The second thing I would argue is you seriously need to listen to what your culture is saying. I find that many apologists are answering questions, or at least apologetics books are answering questions that nobody's asking. And I would say at this point, and I know that Francis Schaeffer lived some time ago, but I'm still convinced that Francis Schaeffer gives us one of the best models of doing apologetics than anybody I've known. And so I would encourage people to consider reading some of the works of Francis Schaeffer to understand how to engage your culture apologetically.
Yeah, what comes to mind there is that in that second part where he talks about listening to what your culture's saying. And I go back to our interview with Ken Samples, who you mentioned earlier, and his Christianity Cross-Examined. One of the things he talked about there was how the questions that people are asking about Christianity are changing. They used to ask the question, is Christianity true? But now they're beginning to ask, is Christianity good? And so his book is partially he still has the evidence in there for the Christianity being true, but it's also a response to that question of, is Christianity true? And so I see him exercising that and listening to what the culture is saying and then trying his best to respond to that.
Mm-hmm. So I got a couple more interview excerpts here we've got three more, but these two will kind of batch together. There's Craig Blomberg and Peter J. Williams, both doing work in the New Testament. So I asked Craig Blomberg what it would be your advice for those who are studying and defending the reliability of the Gospels. So Blomberg says, don't overstate your case, because if it becomes clear that that's what you're doing, then you will lose credibility, at least in some people's minds to some degree, even on those areas where your case is solid. I would also want to appeal to Ephesians 4:15 to speak the truth in love. There seems to be a certain personality trait. On the one hand, God uses mightily that enables certain gifted, bright individuals to speak very boldly in situations from which others would recoil. But some of that same boldness can come across as cockiness and arrogance, and sometimes be perceived as more interested in winning an argument than winning a person. And very few people in the history of the world have ever come to Christ because someone who they find personally obnoxious has nevertheless convinced them with an argument. And so it's a combination of the two put together. We need to understand history. We need to understand what is and is not true, what can and cannot be demonstrated, what is that Christians believe by faith, and what it is that Christians have good historical support to affirm as well. And then we have to remember that we are interacting with human beings who God dearly loves and for whom he sent his Son to die, and we need to love them at least as deeply and passionately as we try to win them with our arguments. Well, we'll comment on that in a moment, but here's Peter J. Williams with a very similar response. So I say, what kind of advice would you give to those who are overall just want to be better defenders of the faith? So Peter J. Williams says, well, I think you got to be very honest. Face difficulties. If there's something you've been defeated on, don't be afraid to say you don't know, and people will respect that. I think if you say, I don't know, but you know what, I'm going to read up about that this week, and I'm going to report to you next time we meet. If that's the sort of relationship you're in, then people will be happy for you to do that. Be careful you don't take too much of the burden of proof, that you are not lazy, but also equally that you're not running around doing all of your legwork when someone else is simply throwing idle questions at you and has no intention of reading or researching anything on the subject. Stick within your competence. You can get into quite a complex area like historical apologetics, provided you don't get tempted to go to the point of thinking that you can answer every question. You can't. So, yeah, a couple of things there where both Blomberg and Williams seem to, basically don't overstate your case. Be very honest and clear.
Yeah, that's what stuck out to me. Again, I hate to keep going back to this, but it's just where my mind goes. When I first discovered apologetics, that my view is when I get in a conversation with somebody, I am going to throw as much at them as I possibly can. And the more I throw at them, hopefully something will stick. It wasn't because I was trying to be obnoxious. It was just because I didn't know any better. I would say now my approach is more, of course, I usually begin with questions and kind of trying to ascertain where they are. But the other thing I do is I just feel like my job is to explain to them why I think Christianity is reasonable or rational, and then allow them to respond to that. My job is just to give a reasonable defense of the faith and allow them to interact with it. And so that really stuck out to me, because I think that although I wouldn't have described myself as cocky or arrogant, it could have come across, or probably did, as overwhelming and also annoying, and me just wanting to be heard and not really being willing to listen. And I think in a conversation, if you're doing it correctly, you should be listening more than you're talking.
Hear, hear. All right. Well, so here's one more. Actually, I was mistaken. There's two more, but we'll call the other one a bonus one. I'm
guessing most of you know who Lee Strobel is. So you got to the delight of interviewing Lee Strobel, which is pretty cool. And you asked him, let me ask you about your experience as a journalist, and what, from a journalist perspective and a researcher, what sort of advice do you have for apologists? And Strobel said, well, I think asking questions is key, and it's the attitude with which we ask them. And it's the curiosity that it's expressed, and it's the willingness to say, I don't have all the facts. I'm not the world's leading expert. That's why I'm asking questions of you. And to say, sometimes you'll see a television journalist and he'll be doing an interview with somebody, and you feel like he's giving more of his opinion than he's getting from the person he's interviewing. because there's real desire to show how much he knows. And I think a good journalist comes in not to try to show how much they know, but to really listen to the knowledge, data, and information from the source in order to be able to understand it and then communicate it effectively to others. So that's what I try to do when I talk to other apologists. I want to not so much talk about what I'm doing. I want to talk about, what are you learning? Where are you growing? And where do you see God blessing your ministry? And what are the cutting edges and growing edges of apologetics in your particular experiences? So I'm always asking questions because I truly want to learn. And I know I don't have all the answers. And yet I know as a journalist that there are answers out there. And one of my joys in journalism was to get a tip on a story and then explore it, investigate it, find the story and publish it, and have a big impact as a result.
Yeah, I like that a lot. You know, asking questions. I like how he shows, like the example he gives there, that the interviewer is someone who's just really wants to show how much he knows, and how if we're interacting with non-believers, sometimes that can be the case. We can come across like we're just waiting for them to finish their sentence so that we can jump in or something like that. And so I like the attitude of curiosity, genuine curiosity, and humility of saying, well, I don't know the answers. That's good.
Yeah. And just to add on to that idea of having to jump in as soon as they finish a sentence or whatnot. And this isn't directly related to the quote, but I still think it's helpful. Mm-hmm. I was talking to somebody the other day about how someone like William Lane Craig in his debates, many times not many times, but sometimes in his debates, there are some snide comments made at him or even occasionally personal attacks. And I've said before that I always find it impressive how he very rarely even responds or acknowledges those comments. And I think to me, it's just it exudes a confidence in his position. And I think in the same way that if we're in a conversation with somebody, we want to be confident in what we're saying. We want to be prepared. And if we're constantly feeling like we can't wait to rebuttal their point as soon as they get done talking, we almost seem like we're coming at the conversation in a way of, I've got to win this, or, oh, I hope they don't say something that I can't rebut. Where if we can just, calmly and listen to them and ask good questions, I think not only is it respectful and it shows them we care, but also I think it expresses a confidence. I
agree. I don't have anything else to say to that other than, I'm just visualizing it in my mind when you're saying it. And it's so true. So true. Right. Well, we're going to end with one by Greg Koukl. I'm going to put this one at the end because it was one good one to end on, I think. So here we go. I say to Greg Koukl, if you could say just one thing, say to a room full of seminary students, ministers, evangelists, and apologists, what would you tell them about their own character development? So this is specifically about character. So Greg Koukl responds, well, I was thinking about this question because I knew it was going to be coming, and there's probably a lot I could say. But one thing that came to me immediately was a line from a song that an old friend of mine, that I hadn't seen for many years, wrote during the Jesus movement here in the States. The song that he used to sing when he would say goodnight. He does a concert, and then he'd sing this little song by way of saying goodnight to the audience. And the line in the song was simply, be as holy in the shadows as you are in the light. And then he added, and so till we meet again, children, good night. And he quotes again, be as holy in the shadows as you are in the light. Till we meet again, good night. Now, that is a very cool guideline. It's not easy to keep, but it's an important one to keep in mind. So if you're talking about your character development, which is, by the way, a huge issue, if you think about people who falter, leaders now who falter badly in their Christian walk, very few of them falter because, some academic thing tripped them up. The thing that breaks them is the moral area of their life. It's their character. And if you think about college students that go away to college, even though there are challenges of academic or intellectual sort, that's not the biggest thing. The biggest thing is they get off on their own and they never learn how to control themselves and manage their own lives, and they go crazy. They get this freedom and they can't manage it, and that sinks their ship spiritually. We've all known that it's easier to be holy in the light, but if we can seek to be as good in the shadows as we are when everybody's watching, then I think we've really accomplished something, and we're going to be well protected from the onslaught.
Wow.
That's a great one. And, all of the different pieces of advice and whatnot from the interviews, that was one that I didn't remember. It didn't stick out, but when I went back and reviewed it, I'm like, wow, that is really a good quote,
Yeah, I love that. Be as holy in the shadows as you are in the light. And we haven't talked about this on the podcast, but some time has passed now. And I just think of that in terms of, Ravi Zacharias. That's what he failed to do, right? He had a hidden life, and it didn't matter how much he knew or how eloquent he was in telling stories and whatnot. Once the curtain was pulled back, it was everything else fell apart. And so just that perfectly illustrates that importance of being as holy in the shadows as you are in the light, or at least striving to be that way.
Well, dear listeners, thank you for staying with us. I hope you've enjoyed those. I think in the show notes, I'll link to the different transcripts if you want to go back to those. Of course, if you go into your podcast player and you scroll back or you search within there, whatever player you've got, you'll find these different interviews, ones with like Edgar Andrews or Lee Strobel or whoever. Go back and dig through there. There's a lot of good timeless resources there that might be of some value. If one of these quotes sticks out to you, then maybe go back and listen to that one this week. That's your assignment. So thanks for listening. We'll see you next time, where we'll be talking to Ken Samples a little bit about logic.
Have a great week.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address, or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast. We also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice. And please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Auten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.